The name of the latest Oxx album is The Primordial Blues, and it came out on August 18th through Nefarious Industries.
Yep,
And I believe this is your fourth full length album. Is that correct?
I think so. Yeah,
So we spoke in some depth about how you and Martin approached this album from a songwriting perspective, and the writing process of the album, as well as writing the sheet music for it before you guys actually played the music. When you actually got together in the studio to start playing it, how did it feel? Did it feel different from when you guys were writing it out and making demos?
yeah, definitely. We've been we sort of painted ourselves into a corner in that a lot of it turned out to be even harder to play than we'd imagined when we wrote it out. So it felt, yeah, stressful, I guess.
Stressful in a good way, or it seems like this album is very ambitious for you. It's a little bit of a jump from what you did in the past.
Yeah, I think so. Both ways, I think. Stressful in a good way, but also in the throwing you into a mild existential crisis about your adequacy as a musician kind of way. So yeah, both.
I mean, it's interesting to me because I speak with a lot of guys who basically teenagers who formed to sound like their favorite bands, and they do sound like their favorite bands, and a lot of them are very great musicians. And some of them are not, but that's also not really the point of that type of music. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
They just want to be as fast and brutal as possible. I'm curious where your feelings as somebody who actually comes from a music school background, where your feelings of inadequacy come from. Is it maybe going past your ambitions? Do you feel like your ambitions are greater than your reach to some extent?
Yeah, definitely, all the time. I think, yeah, some of it is yes, is sort of, yeah, relates to what you just said, like a more general or abstract connection to what's actually possible in music and on an instrument, and being painfully aware of not being at that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, it's sort of a big part of that whole jazz thing, for example, is transcription, like transcribing other people's solos, which I used to do a lot, and yeah, and still do, and sort of being confronted with how many levels of musicianship separates myself in this case from John Coltrane or Charlie Parker or something like that. It's inspiring and painful to be constantly reminded of. And I think that's same thing goes for heavy guitar based music. Like, listening to, like, every time Sugar or Oxbow or whatever puts out a new record, like it becomes immediately apparent how shitty of a songwriter I am, and how far there is to go still. And so, and I think as long as it doesn't turn self-destructive, that's a pretty healthy thing to sort of try to stay in connection with. But and the other part of it, which I think is relevant when talking about like the other kind of musician, for lack of a better term, is I think there's definitely some like shades of imposter syndrome as well, in that, like, death metal, for example, or like any kind of heavy music or hardcore, that's a craft and a language as well, and a tradition that you have to sort of, if you're doing that kind of music, you have to have some sort of connection to that, to the tradition, and a reverence for it. And the music has to acknowledge that, either in a traditionalist way, like there's a ton of bands that still sounds like death metal coming out of Florida in the early 90s,
Yeah.
which is great. Like, I love a lot of that stuff, and I think it's a noble pursuit to just sort of keep chipping away at trying to perfect that aesthetic. So I'm not distancing myself from that at all, but like, that's one way of acknowledging the tradition, and the other way would be something more iconoclastic, like breaking it down. But either way, like, if you want to write that kind of music, you have to know the craft, and you have to respect the tradition and pay tribute to it. And I think that's something I'm thinking about a lot as well when writing this stuff. Like, it's I'm scared sometimes that veer too far from what the music is actually about, which is still loud, heavy music played on distorted instruments with screaming vocals. And as long as we keep doing that, I feel like we have to, yeah, acknowledge that fact and the context that it's a part of in in a respectful and authentic way. And I get pretty scared a lot of the time about, I don't know, I guess losing a connection to that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense to me. But also, I find it interesting. I apologize for the tangents because, we're supposed to be promoting an album, and I think between the two of us, we're going to make a number of digressions away from.
Yeah, I'd
away
rather
from the
just have a
actual.
good time talking about music, so don't apologize.
Okay. But I do find it interesting that you said that because, especially from the music background that I come from, if the band that you got into in high school was playing fast music and then 5 years later they weren't playing fast music, everyone would get up in arms and say that, that band is a sellout.
Yeah.
That band is not, they're no longer true or cult or whatever.
Yep.
But, with your background, I mean, I don't know what your background was before you went to music school, but I also feel like your background is wide enough and entrenched in a real musical history enough that I mean, isn't it somewhat irrelevant what other people think or would say about any of Oxx's music? Because at the end of the day, you're the only one who really gets, well, you and your bandmates are the only ones who really get to decide what Oxx is, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's very true. And yeah, an important point as well. And so I should probably clarify that it's more maybe an ideological thing or a matter of principle. Like in more formalized music, like classical or jazz, people are super conscious about that whole tradition thing and learning the craft and all that, both in ways good and bad. But like even the most avant-garde, far-out composers or improvisers in those realms, at least, have spent a lot of time and energy sort of getting acquainted with the tradition and being conscious of what's come before them. So for me, it's more it's a matter of maybe principles of aesthetics that I've for my own sake and for my own peace of mind, I need to keep myself in check and make sure that I'm not appropriating a language that is not sincere to me or that I don't have a deep connection with. And that's something that, yeah, regardless of what kind of music we were making, that would be important. But doing the whole heavy music thing as well, that's super important to me. Like actually reminding myself of what I love about heavy music and the records I grew up loving and the ones I still do. If you can you excuse a short digression, like a very brief tangent, but
Sure.
yeah. Okay, so I think it might be an overcorrection, but for me it comes from like, so when Miss Sugar came out with Obscene especially, and maybe Nothing as well before that, but when they sort of went really far off into that like super specific aesthetic that they've arrived at, super complex conceptual stuff, they got a lot of, or probably not noticeable on a commercial level, but they got a lot of crossover success with sort of the more artsy, pretentious music crowd. And so jazz
Yeah.
people, for example, and indie rock people started digging the Sugar, right?
Yeah. They're opening for Tool and stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And jazz drummers especially started talking about Thomas Hoge and the stuff he was doing. And one of the unfortunate consequences of that were that people with no connection to heavy music started to play riffs on downtuned guitars at very weird times in different kinds of music, which is like blending genres is, of course, completely legitimate. But to me at least, I feel like it's super obvious when it's not sincere and when it's done by people who have no idea of what, or at least no depth to the way that they perceive the aesthetic or the tradition that they try to appropriate. And I think that's sort of where I'm coming from when I keep emphasizing the importance of being conscious of that tradition as well and staying respectful of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I see your point. it's funny because it's so much of it is just feeling and not being able to put into words what it is when you say, this is quote unquote metal, this is quote unquote punk rock, but it is something that when you hear it, you're like, oh, this is it. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Like that, within like death or black metal, it's like that feeling of evil. Within, doom metal, it's that feeling of ominous. And, I couldn't possibly, list the number of arguments I've gotten into people who are like, no, this is not, okay, this is slow and it's quote unquote heavy,
Yeah.
but it's not heavy metal.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's not doom. It's not, this is something else.
Yep.
This is just like slow hard rock, or this is like heavy, loud blues.
Yep.
It's not the same thing as metal.
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. But at the same time, on this album, you do expand your sound to a certain extent. You brought in some guest musicians, especially on the title track. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, definitely.
And how you
you
conceptualize that?
And again, I'm struggling with grandiloquence, but I'll do my best not to veer off into unnecessary tangents here. But I think the shortest possible version goes something like this. So, brief detour to the lyrics. The record is written as like a very, very, very watered down version of what is called a sonnet corona, which is a series of sonnets. Like, and to those who don't geek out about poetry, a sonnet is a very specific set of rules for writing a poem. There has to be a specific number of syllables in every line, and they have to rhyme in a certain way, and the lines have to interconnect on a micro and macro level in very specific ways. And so a sonnet corona is taking those rules and expanding them to an even macro level, so to say. So you write out 12 individual sonnets, and then the sonnets have to correspond with each other, following the same rules as the individual ones. So super geeky, pretentious stuff. Point is, I was sort of playing with that idea when writing the lyrics for this record without like in any way being smart enough to do the actual sonnet corona. But the way it ended up being was that the lyrics to the title track that I'm sort of trying my best to talk about consists of specific pieces of lyrics from each of the previous songs in the same sequence that the songs appear on the record. And so that was sort of the outset for that came before a lot of writing the music as well. And so we tried to integrate that pretty consciously in the way we wrote the music. And so the function of the string quartets at the beginning and the end of the title track is an attempt to sort of hint at the same kind of structure in that it incorporates a lot of musical motifs from throughout the album. And then the idea of doing that as a string quartet is, of course, to recontextualize it in a pretty obvious way, in that like it's a viola and two violins and a cello playing the stuff instead of me and Martin and Anders. But so what it is, the intro and the outro of that track is a lot of music from the rest of the record, and of course, specifically from the title track as well, being used in sneaky ways and trying to form a coherent piece out of that. So for me, the function of those sections are twofold. Both, like, they serve as maybe an initial conclusion to the record, in that it summarizes what has come before, probably only in ways that I notice, but still it does, and it matters to me that it's there. And then secondly, it sort of lays out a lot of what's going to happen in the rock band part of the song, so to speak, in that it's the same material that we're working with, but just in vastly different ways. Gotcha.
And the performers who you brought in, were they people that you knew from your time at the conservatory?
Yeah, one of them. So there's it's one girl, a girl called Christina, who's credited with playing all the violins and the viola, who's a much more accomplished musician than I am. And so she layered like almost all of the strings that you hear in those sections on top of each other, and because her intonation and playing is so good, like it blends together perfectly. And then we brought in another cello player, and then there's a double bass on there as well, which is a guy I know from conservatory, who I have played with in something completely different.
And all instrumentation for the viola, the cello, the piano, this was all written out in your sheet music.
Yeah, it was.
How close was the finished recording to what you originally envisioned when you composed the song?
Surprisingly close. I was super nervous about, especially about the string quartet parts of it, because it's not something I'm as experienced in as in, just writing stupid riff music. But I think it turned out pretty good. And as for the actual music played by Oxx, I think I probably for the first time, I haven't been able to say this about anything else we've done, but for this record, I think it turned out better than we'd imagined and that we'd hoped for.
And do you think that with the extra instrumentation, this is a direction that you want to explore more in the future?
Okay, so this has the potential to be another tangent. Just a disclaimer before, and please stop me if I stray too far from the path. Because yeah, we have talked about that, and would definitely like to do it, but I feel like it has to be incorporated from the outset of writing that kind of music. Like if we are to work more closely with a wider array of instruments than the core band of guitar, bass, and drums, the music has to be written specifically for that, and even the concepts, the aesthetic considerations preceding the writing of the music have to take that into consideration as well. Like I feel sort of and that's especially apparent on the Danish heavy music scene at the moment. So I don't know how accurately it applies to heavy music in general, but I feel like there's a trend at the moment, and has been for the last 10 years or so, of people sort of getting credited with being like visionary and experimental simply for the fact that they use instruments not traditionally heard in heavy music, without actually writing anything novel or adventurous, or being conscious to the necessary degree of incorporating those kind of instruments. So I feel like it's sort of an easy way to gain street cred with the artsy metal crowd, just to use novel instruments. And yeah, I don't know, I get super self-conscious about that kind of stuff, and would, if I have my way, I'd want to avoid that and spend a lot of energy in actually trying to incorporate it. So like if we continue on the same track and want to write another record, then we can go out and tour with and play live in like with the core band. We probably won't lean too heavily into that kind of stuff, because for it to make sense to use those kind of instruments, it would have to be integral to the songs to the degree where it wouldn't make sense to perform them without them. So probably the shorter answer to your question would be, the best way for us to do that, I think, would be as a standalone project, like record a record specifically for doing that, and then trying to set up shows and tours specifically in continuation of that record. But for it to continue to play a larger role in the overall aesthetic of Oxx and what we're doing on our standalone record, so to speak, we would have to expand the lineup permanently. So like if we for some reason got a violin player as a permanent member of the band, or a horn section or whatever, it would definitely become like a crucial, integral part to the songwriting process. But until that's possible, or until we get the budget to actually pay people to tour with us like that, which we won't, I think it'll probably be a side quest or a digression from the main lineage of Oxx Records.